Yeah. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Let's Debate. I'm Sweet Pea, and this is my co-host, Let's Fam, and we will be your moderators for tonight. Unfortunately, our gorgeous Sparrow can't join us tonight, but you'll all be able to see her next time. Our topic for tonight's debate is gun control in the US, and this promises to be a most excellent and spicy debate. Thank you for joining us and for being here. Please hit the like button and subscribe to us for more enjoyable content. We have Kaisersultan in one corner for no gun control, and in the other corner, the opposition is P Barnz for gun control. We will have up to 10 minutes opening per side and 1 hour open dialogue and a short closing statement followed by audience questions. Please remember to tag moderators or Let's Debate with your questions to forward to our debaters. Please remember to be polite, do not attack each other, do not attack our guest speakers, and have a great evening. Now, since you're not here to listen to me prattle on, let's get to the show. P Barnz, you will be going first. The mic is all yours.
Amazing. Thank you so much for the introduction, Sweet Pea, and thank you to our moderators today for what's been a long coming debate. Thanks so much, Kaiser, for being here. I'd like to be more excited about having this conversation. I enjoy debates. I enjoy talking about important topics. I have to admit, this one I'm not as enthused about. Now, the reason that the necessity for this conversation is so frustrating to me is because every other Western country, including those that are 100% analogous with the US, solved this issue nearly 30 years ago. Firstly, many opponents of sensible gun control pretend that the US is somehow unique in its situation and that it's impossible to compare its current situation with other countries. Well, I'd contest that that's just nonsense. The US isn't special in its birth. Many countries, including my own, have a special affinity with firearms in their birth and their early years. The US isn't the only country that had a dangerous frontier, that had to throw off the shackles of English or other colonial oppression. Many countries still live under that colonial oppression, but it only seems to be the US that displays this level of gun fetish that the US currently does. The immutable nature of the US Constitution is also largely fabricated. 183 countries around the world have constitutions, many of those with far stricter rules around amending and changing and adding and removing things from their constitutions. The sad reality is that in 2021, 48,830 people died at the hands of gun violence in the US, more than any other year on record, with over 100,000 individuals shot. 8 out of 10 murders in the US in 2021 were committed with a gun. And why wouldn't they? It's something that's purpose-built to take life. That's its only purpose. It has no other utility within society other than to kill people. As of April 30th of this year, there have been more mass shootings than days in the calendar. The states with the highest level of gun violence are, not surprisingly, conservative states. And overall, the USA ranks 20th as the most dangerous country in the world in regard to gun deaths, with a death rate of 10.6 per 100 people, well above other comparable Western countries. Let's have a look at a few of those. France currently has 2.7 deaths per 100,000 people. Canada, the US's northern neighbor, which it shares its longest land border with, 2.1 per 100,000. Australia, my country, 1 per 100,000. Germany, 0.9 per 100,000. Spain, 0.6 per 100,000. Let's take a closer look at some of the stats in those countries. In particular, let's have a look at how each of these completely comparable countries react to their child mortality rates. Now, France, the biggest killer of children aged 1 to 14 is cancer. Now, what is France doing about the biggest killer of its children? Well, France spends roughly 2.2% of its gross domestic product funding research and development into cancer research, and there are initiatives that receive specific funding by the French National Cancer Institute of up to $48 million in funding each year purely for cancer research. In Canada, it's traffic accidents. What's Canada doing about its biggest killer of children aged 1 to 14? Well, Canada plans to spend $605 million in community projects over to 2023. One such plan being Project Zero, which has halved traffic accidents in areas that it's already been started in. Canada's actively doing something. It's recognised what kills its children aged 1 to 14, and it's actively doing something. Australia, again, it's traffic accidents. What's Australia doing? Well, given the geography and reliance on car travel that Australia has a specific federal government department, the Office of Road Safety, that's spending $3 billion over the next 10 years under the National Road Safety Strategy. Germany, again, cancer. Germany has a long history of being on the forefront of cancer research and medical research. It spends $6.4 billion a year in medical research. Cancer research is ubiquitous amongst the tertiary education system in Germany. Spain, I couldn't find any statistics on because I don't speak Spanish, but I'm guessing at 0.6 per 100,000, kids are probably pretty safe from gun violence. Instead of Spain, let's have a look at Sierra Leone, a country that's largely still being ravaged by colonialism in Central Africa. Sierra Leone has a child mortality rate of over 80 per 100,000, which is a truly sad statistic. The biggest killer of children aged 1 to 14 in Sierra Leone is tetanus and malaria infections. What's Sierra Leone doing? Well, of its $4 billion gross domestic product, they're spending over $300 million on hospitals and also on programs that assist with vaccination and childhood mortality. Even a country with as few resources as Sierra Leone is actively doing something about the biggest killer of children aged 1 to 14. Now, let's have a look at the US. What's the biggest killer of children in the US aged 1 to 14? Well, if it isn't guns. Tetanus and malaria are completely preventable diseases, but they pale in comparison to how easy it is to prevent the death of a child at the hands of a gun. And the people in the US have recognized this and want something done about it. 81% of Americans support raising the age of requirement to own a gun to 21. 80% support requiring mental health checks for all gun purchases. 80% said police should be allowed to take guns away from people considered a danger to themselves and others. And even 61% supported banning assault rifles and semi-automatic weapons. 81% of Democrats support doing something about gun control, and only 20% of Republicans 81% of Democrats support doing something about gun control, and unfortunately only 20% of Republicans share the same outlook. What is the US doing about this 100% preventable and internationally shameful statistic? Well, to coin a very Aussie term, the US are doing 3/5 of fuck all about it. You could almost say that certain groups are doing the exact opposite. They are, in fact, by implication, Republican legislators are actually promoting and profiting off the death of children at the hands of gun violence. The American gun lobby spends, on average, between $13 to $20 million per year to ensure the Republican politicians ignore pleas from the public around gun reform. In 2012, after the Sandy Hook massacre, the NRA membership hit over 5 million. And every time a child gets shot in a school, membership goes up in these organizations. Wayne LaPierre has been the CEO of the NRA for many years now. He's been known to send his thoughts and prayers to grieving families of school shooting victims from expensive locations such as the Bahamas, which is where he spent the aftermath of Sandy Hook on a yacht. He's even been accused of embezzling membership funds to pay for these expensive trips. Let's put some of those points together. So children get shot in school massacres. Membership goes up in the NRA and other organizations. Funding swells. Membership funding swells. That means more funding is available to Republicans for their election campaigns, and that also means that the CEO, and it's been alleged, the CEO and other members of leadership put some of that money in their own pocket. Okay, put all those stats together. Let's have a look at some specifics around educational systems while we're talking about school shootings. Texas has some of the lowest educational outcome statistics in the US. Due to the bigotry of old God-fearing white men that currently run the state. School libraries are all but empty. Teachers fear the felony charges that would be imposed if a teacher inadvertently used a book that Karen found a naughty word in. What are Texas doing? Texas have decided that teachers who apparently can't be trusted to select an appropriate book for children should have guns in the schools. That's their answer. Florida recently had a closed door. Ron DeSantis recently in a closed door meeting that wasn't the public wasn't allowed to attend. He signed a bill with the NRA pretty much allowing for concealed carry anywhere in Florida. The effort to do nothing is partisan. The effort to do nothing is well funded. The effort to do nothing is in direct contradiction to all research on the topic. And I'll repeat, it is an international disgrace. To bring things here and to other more rational countries, in early 1996, within the space of 6 weeks, the UK and Australia experienced some of the most tragic incidents of gun violence in their histories. At 1 p.m. on the 28th of April, 1996, 31-year-old Martin Bryant sat down for a meal at a popular cafe at a local tourist attraction in Tasmania. He ate a meal, he opened a sports bag, he pulled out an AR-15, and he killed 20 people within 90 seconds. By the time he was caught the next day, he'd killed 35 people and injured another 23. In the decade up to 1996, Australia had seen 12 mass shootings and firearm deaths were at 2.84 per 100,000. In a move that no one really saw coming, a man that would turn out to be one of our most horribly racist conservative leaders responded to opinion polling that was quite similar to where the US is now on its opinion polling, and he pledged to do something. Australia at the time had a politically powerful rural community that was very, very concerned with government overreach. Australia had a very powerful gun lobby at the time that threatened civil war if people tried to take their guns away from them. And technically, the power to legislate gun reform was a power that states protected viciously. Does any of that sound familiar to the current situation that the US finds itself in? It took less than a week for Australians to ignore the shrill, childish protests against gun reform. And moving forward, all gun sales were needed to be recorded in a national registry. Anyone who owns a gun needed a genuine reason. And here's a hint from Australia from the last 30 years. Self-defense is not a legitimate reason to own a firearm. Military-style semi-automatic rifles and shotguns were banned, which reflects the reality of their lack of requirement in a society that likes their children to be alive and to stay alive and see adulthood. If you own a gun, you need to be able to store it safely. Farmers still own firearms and use them responsibly for pest control. Sport shooters generally keep their firearms at the range and have been unaffected by the new laws. Simple, straightforward reforms that a child could have come up with. Since the reform, reductions in gun crime was already on the reduction in Australia, but it accelerated it and it reduced by 5% per year from 2.84 per 100 down to the less than 1 per 100,000 that we have now. Australia has only seen 2 mass shootings, and its most recent mass shooting was inspired by US-style libertarian Christian nationalism. So essentially, the lack of US action on its extremism is a direct cause of one of our only mass shootings since we did something about it. The problem is not too big. The problem is not one of some sort of American exceptionalism. This is not a problem that exists because it's too hard to fix. This is a problem that is. This is a simple problem with a simple solution. I'll give up the rest of my time to the moderator.
Thank you for your opening statement. Kaisersultan, would you like to make your opening statement now? The mic is all yours.
Is my sound going through? Just give me a thumbs up if it is. Okay, so mine's gonna be really quickly. He said that the U.S. is not unique. It is because no other country has 500 million guns. That's the first point. He said that's incorrect. Secondly, he said a bunch of nice statements and everything. It's really, if you actually examine it, yes, the U.S. has the highest gun death rate, but that's just because guns are accessible. So if you're going to kill someone, you're going to use a gun. In terms of actual per capita murder and violent crime, it's not necessarily. It is higher than most other developed countries, but it's not astronomically higher. So I would say that um, it's more of a social economic issue in that if you remove the causes of crime, then you're going to remove a large portion of gun deaths. 48%, 42 to 48% of gun deaths in the U.S. are suicides. So obviously that is, something that is another social and healthcare issue. So if you fix the um, the mental health crisis the U.S. has and a lot of the socioeconomic problems, you'll see a massive reduction in gun crime. So yeah, I guess that will be my two opening points.
For your opening statement. We will now move into the open dialogue where our debaters will have up to 1 hour to cross-examine each other. Debaters, please begin.
All right, awesome. Do you mind if I start? I have a couple of questions on those two points for you. So
Yeah, go ahead. I'll let you
I'm a little bit confused because you seem to have said that it's a socio-economic issue, but also that it's to do with the mental health crisis and suicide rates. Firstly, on suicide rates, the presence of the presence of guns in the community actually exacerbates suicide rates, according to research. I think it was through Harvard. Sorry, I'm bringing up my. Yeah, through. No, not Harvard. It's through. Wow. Sorry, it's too early in the morning here. The New England Journal of Medicine shows that having a firearm in the house. And look, I should probably do a trigger warning. I am going to talk about suicide and some of the causes of suicide. So anyone listening out there, please reach out to local resources if you are feeling down. Feeling down for long terms isn't normal. So please seek local support. Seek support from your GP if you are having those sorts of issues. Owning a gun increases your risk of dying by suicide by 2 to 10 times. What we know about suicide is the vast majority of suicide is self-limiting. So it's to do with a single instance, broken relationship, losing a job, a run-in with the over-militarized US police force. More than 90% of people who survive, the majority of people who survive don't use a gun. It's funny when you actually when you try to commit suicide with something that's designed to kill a person, you're usually more successful. And those that survive rarely attempt suicide again. So I'd argue that removing guns would prevent suicide, or at least that's what the research shows.
I mean, you're still left with the underlying issue that people are being driven to suicide. So, I mean, the issue with what you're saying is that you're saying in regards to single instance suicides that having a lethal weapon around in a on the spur moment leads to an instant suicide incident. That's what I'm saying is that I'm sure they could find if they were that driven to kill themselves that violently, even without a gun, they'd be able to find a way. It's just that because most people have guns, that's the easy, violent way they're going to commit short suicide.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I'm saying. Removing the gun from the situation reduces your risk of dying by suicide
They'll
by
themselves in the
10.
neck, or jump in front of a car or something, or go suicide by cop.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is people who use other means are more likely to survive, and if you survive,
Okay,
you are
if
less
in the
likely.
neck,
You are
shoot
less
yourself
likely
in the
to
head,
try
you're
again.
gonna die. You have the same, chance of surviving. What I'm trying to say is that your argument is that because guns offer an instant way to kill yourself, then in the cases where a suicide is an immediate reaction, that removing guns would remove the ability to kill yourself instantly. I'm saying that's not the case because you can do it with other utensils and other equipment.
I'm not necessarily saying that. The data shows that that's the case. That if you owning a gun,
the argument that this data shows that if you remove guns, the immediate suicide based on a short-term reaction will decrease. I'm saying that that's not the case. I'm putting forward the argument that if you remove the guns, you would just kill yourself with another utensil that will provide instant death.
Right. Well, the data directly contradicts that. Do you have some sort of evidence that that's the case that supports
data does not contradict it. The data presents firearms as being the most available way to violently kill yourself. If you remove that, they're just going to go to the next most widely available thing to kill yourself.
The data shows that if you own a firearm, you are more likely to die at the hands of that firearm from suicide. The data also shows that those who use those that attempt to kill themselves using other forms are far more likely to survive. And if you survive, you're more likely to seek treatment and you are less likely to attempt suicide. That's directly what the data shows. So it's the data isn't showing that removing
the data set that you are describing puts forth firearms, right, as the most common form of violent quick death. Is that correct?
It's not the most common form, but it is the most lethal. People rarely survive a suicide attempt when they use a firearm.
Okay, so
can I finish the statement? People are far less likely to survive if they attempt to commit suicide using a firearm, right? And if they do use other means, which the majority of suicide attempts are through other means, 90% of people who survive a first attempt won't try to commit suicide again. They will seek the help that they need. Having a gun in the home increases your chances of anyone, right? I'm not just talking about people who do have some sort of suicide ideation. Even people who consider themselves normal, healthy people, having a gun in your home increases your risk of dying by suicide by 2 to 10%. That's what the data shows. The data doesn't just show, well, this is the most likely way to die, and the data doesn't show that if you don't have a gun, you're just going to go to the next highest and die anyway. That's not what the data shows.
So with that is that you would have to isolate.
It does.
You'd have to isolate firearm access away from other violent mean access in order to make that conclusion. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, that's what studies do, and that's what they've done.
But not what your study has said, because your study is based on the assumption that so in other words, you'd have to do two things, right, in order to draw your conclusion from the study. The data shows that if you have a firearm in your house, you are more likely to, in the event of a negative occurrence in your life, kill yourself. That's what the data shows, correct?
It shows that if you own a firearm, your risk of dying by suicide is increased by 2 to 10 times. That's what the data shows.
Added to that by saying it's because that death by firearms are normally based on a short-term position because of an immediate incident that's just happened, such as losing your job. You said that, correct?
No, that's part of the study. That's more of sort of a meta-analysis of suicide, and it's part of the supporting evidence that goes into the study. Now, mind you, this is a meta-analysis of a number of studies that have been completed on the topic that was completed by the New England Journal of Medicine that found that many cases of suicide are self-limiting. And are one-off, and people who seek treatment will rarely make a second attempt. But having a firearm in the house greatly reduces your ability to survive that first attempt. So I guess the broader point is I guess, can you expand on why you think, because you brought up suicide as some sort of as part of your argument as to why the US shouldn't have gun reform. I guess, can you expand on that a little bit as to why you think that because suicides are, and you're right, suicides are between 40 to 50% of 50% of gun deaths in the US. Can you expand on why you think this isn't a reason for the US to make some sort of sensible gun reform?
If you alleviate the rate of suicide by offering better health care and mental health access and improving the socioeconomic conditions that drive people to suicide, you would lower the suicide attempt rate. And in doing so, you would limit or you would reduce the number of people who also kill themselves by guns.
Right. Are the proponents of or are the opponents of gun control in the US, are they proponents of changes in mental health treatment? I don't think they are they? I think the same people. I think the same people that voted.
The issue is that you're trying to characterize all opponents of gun control as, right-wing Republicans, when that's just not the case.
That's the vast majority.
Ownership is not necessarily divided entirely by political or economic affiliations.
Sure. Is it Democrat?
Characterization of America being split 50% Democrat and 50% Republican, and that all the Republicans own the guns and that all the Democrats own the guns, is actually a false paradigm. If we examine the United States, we see that, firstly, I believe I believe it's between 33 and 36% of the population that is eligible to vote is actually affiliated with a political party. So right there, you already have 2/3 of the population which is not necessarily affiliated, and so describing them as Republican or Democrat is not necessarily an accurate representation. And the United States has 400 billion guns that have been sold since 1986. If we assume a lower end sale of 100 million firearms before that date, we get a figure of around 500 million guns in a population of 300 million people. Someone who owns over 17 firearms is considered a super collector, and I believe, I could be wrong on this, is under, I believe under 20% of the population own that many firearms. So what you see is a widespread proliferation of firearms among the general population, regardless of political affiliation. And so when you say, do opponents of gun control support healthcare, I would turn around and say, why are you trying to group all opponents of gun control as right-wing Republicans with specific economic views? Because the reality is that firearm ownership in the United States is, how would you say it, is a cross-political phenomena. And yeah, that's what I would say.
Sure. I'm not necessarily trying to split the US population down the center. The statistics and the polling that I brought up were not. I only actually brought up one statistic that was party affiliated. And look, I'd argue, regardless of how many people vote or how many people are registered, the fact that the Democrats are. And look, let me put my hand up and say I'm neither a fan of the Democrat or the Republican Party. I'm neither a fan of either of the two major parties in Australia either. I'm just looking at the outcomes and what they're trying to do, and I don't think anyone would argue that the Democrats are actively trying to prevent gun control in the US. And when I split things down political lines in the US, it's due to those in power. I agree with you. It is an extremely small number of people within the US government that are preventing some sort of sensible reform to gun control, right? And they're the ones. What I'm talking about is I'm talking about the well-funded by the gun lobby, minority of leaders within the Republican Party that are preventing some sort of reform. And I'm also suggesting that they're the same people that wouldn't lift a finger about mental health. So I don't think this is about people per se. I don't think this is about splitting the population. What we do know is that 80% of the US population are in favor of some sort of gun control, about at least doing something, anything, right? But when it comes to those who are actually holding up progress, it is Republicans, and they're well funded.
Some new information to the table because I think you're just not aware of this. 47 of the 50, lawsuits currently in state courts regarding protecting firearm ownership have been filed with by FPC, GOA, or local state pistol and rifle associations. These are non-NRA funded organizations, and these are grassroots organizations which have a very diverse support base. So actually, I would put forth to you that legally, in terms of the actual political environment and legal environment surrounding firearm ownership, Republicans in the federal government are actually quite inactive in preserving gun rights, and it's actually grassroots organizations like FPC, GOA, for example, California Pistol and Rifle Association, New York Pistol and Rifle Association, the Oklahoma, I forget the name now, but these groups are all grassroots organizations that have allied. They're locally funded by donations from the local population, and their support base, I would argue, based on my interactions with people, is very diverse. So the organizations preventing confiscation of firearms and preserving gun rights are not funded by groups such as the NRA. These are local funded grassroots organizations.
You mentioned California and New York, right? So Democrat-run states. So basically what you're saying is that there's lawsuits that have been taken by grassroots organizations in states that are democratically controlled because Republicans can't actually do anything to overturn the law. Do you think that
in those specific states that is true, but
yeah,
these gun rights organizations are active in all 50 states. So for example, in Illinois right now, there's a lawsuit against the assault weapon ban. The same in California's magazine restrictions. We had a Supreme Court decision by the New York Pistol Rifle Association that preserved the right to carry outside of the home with less stringent licensing requirements. You have in Maryland the challenges to the assault weapons ban there. In Texas, you had the challenge to the state's requirement to be 21 to own a handgun. So it's throughout the United States, the various state laws that infringe on individual gun rights. These organizations are grassroots. They are not politically aligned. And the reason I can say they're not politically aligned is because if you go on their website, they have very long written articles and pieces targeting Republican officials who are not as supportive of people's rights to own firearms. And at the same time, they also have articles regarding, for example, when the New York city mayor was running in his election in the beginning, he made some statements which he went back on, where he hinted that he may be more open to legal firearm ownership. And when that came out, these organizations were quite, they wrote a lot of pieces in support of him, which they later rescinded when he rescinded his support for legal firearm ownership. So the point I'm trying to make is that these organizations are non-politically aligned, and they are the ones making, in the legislature at a state level, and in the case of, for example, the New York Pistol Rifle Association at a federal level, they are the ones removing the infringement on gun rights.
Well, they're taking legal action, is what you've said. So these are organizations that are taking legal action in largely Democratic-run states. Do you think that in those states, if the Republicans controlled those states, that the Republicans wouldn't just change the law in their favor anyhow? I'd put it to you that they probably would. All you've really done is you've presented that, yeah, there are fringe groups in all states that don't like gun control, and if they find themselves in a state that's democratically controlled, and those legislatures have actually tried to do something about gun ownership, they take legal action. They just go around the legislation.
Okay, iterate again. These organizations operate in all 50 states. They're not isolated to democratic states, and their action is not isolated to democratic states. Because these organizations are not partisan, they operate solely on the basis of gun rights. They challenge both Democratic and Republican controlled legislators in both Democrat and Republican states. The point I'm trying to illustrate to you is that support and insistence on firearm rights for civilians in the United States is more of a nonpartisan issue than you are presenting. And so, for example, when you say if Republicans were to, take over, control the legislature in a state like California, they would rescind the attempts, or let's say the ineffective gun laws that California has presented. I would turn around and say the policies regarding guns is irrelevant depending on Democrat and Republican. It's a specific issue that is cross-partisan. So just because a Republican legislature takes control in California, it does not necessarily mean that California would remove its gun laws. And the reason I say this is because in California, the gun laws were actually first enacted by a Republican governor, which was Ronald Reagan. And then under his presidency, they introduced the Hughes Amendment, which banned assault rifles, which are semi-automatic rifles with the ability to switch to fully automatic rates of fire. So
yep, we got rid of those. We got rid of those in the 90s.
And we look at the policies, it shows that gun control is implemented by both Democrats and Republicans. On the other hand, attempts to fight gun control are done by nonpartisan groups. So I don't see how, if a Republican or Democrat took office, Republicans may say that they would do that, but the historical record shows that they are actually the ones who implement gun laws at the same rate, or perhaps slightly less, but the major gun laws in the United States have been implemented by Republican governors and a Republican president.
Right. So what you're saying is that, and look, I find this really, really hard to believe, but just to summarize what you've said, you're saying that Republicans aren't a major force preventing gun reform, and that when you actually look at looking at both sides of politics, you're going to tell me that that gun control is not a completely 100% partisan issue. If that's the case, why does the NRA funds predominantly Republican election campaigns? Why do they pay between $13 to $20 million a year to Republican officials?
When was the last time the NRA filed a lawsuit or enacted any action to protect?
So wonderful.
The NRA is not
question.
An organization that a lot of gun owners support. I believe their membership right now is. Let me pull this up because
it would have after the recent school shooting, it would have gone up. It usually goes up.
We're looking at what.
But that wasn't while you looked that up. Could you answer the question that I asked? Why does the NRA pay between $13 to $20 million each year purely to Republican politicians? If gun control is such a nonpartisan issue and it's not actually the Republican Party that's holding up some sort of gun reform in the US, why do the NRA exclusively pay or funds and give money to Republican candidates?
The thing to you is that it doesn't matter what the NRA does, because the NRA is not the organization that is protecting gun rights. The NRA can give money to Republicans. That does not necessarily mean the NRA is the organization that is upholding gun rights, because as I have illustrated, in the past, in the past 20 years, all major removal of infringements on gun rights have been done by organizations that are not the NRA. You keep bringing up the NRA. What I'm saying is that the NRA is not the organization that protects gun rights. And so it's irrelevant what money they give to the Republican legislature and the Republican federal thing. But if we take your line of argument, the Republican legislature does not necessarily remove or prevent enacting gun law at a federal level. And I make this distinction because at a state level, as I've shown, they have enacted very strong gun control laws. At a federal level, currently in the United States Congress and the Senate, the Republican politicians do not, or they vote against gun infringement laws, because if they were to vote for it, they would get outvoted by their constituents. So they act in this specific issue in the interest of their constituents. And the reason they do this is because firearm ownership for a large number of Americans in red states is almost a one policy issue, in that they may vote specifically on whether or not a politician protects gun rights or not.
Okay.
We probably,
sorry, go on.
Because we can see that at a state and federal level in the past, both Republicans and Democrats have enacted gun laws. The reason that right now you see Republicans opposing gun infringement laws is because they're being put forth by the Democrats, and they're unpopular, extremely unpopular amongst Republican, constituents. So, in other words, it's a reaction to the Democrats adopting gun control as a party motive, or a party. It's a policy the Democrats have really stuck their heels in, and something they're trying to push forward. If Democrats dropped the ball, then I think you would see a lot more Republicans move forward to supporting gun reform. It's opposed by a large part as a reaction to it simply being a Democrat proposed policy, and at the same time, it's also a wildly unpopular. Gun infringement is wildly unpopular amongst constituents of Republican senators and congressmen. But
yeah, Republican.
Here's what I would say.
We should probably
we can argue the semantics of
we should probably move on.
Legal and who supports them. I'd like to take a different approach here. Practically, and let's discuss specific policy here.
Can I just respond? Can I just respond to what you've said first? Can we stick to one topic, and can I respond to what you've already said? Sure, because I agree. We should probably move on to something more substantial as it comes to why you think that gun reform shouldn't happen. Because what we're talking about at the moment is who. And look, I've just brought up news articles here, and this is from the past week. Nevada are pushing bills that would Nevada's just vetoed a Democratic-led bill that sought to limit the age to possess a firearm. Lauren Boebert's introduced a bill that would push aside the 2022 bipartisan gun safety compromise. Currently, Kentucky, Ohio, Nebraska, Texas, Virginia, Republicans are pushing to limit gun-free zones, remove background checks, and roll back red flag laws. So what you're saying about gun control being a Democrat-pushed and Republicans being the ones that that have put in increased gun control is just nonsense. So, but yeah, let's move on to something that's a little bit more substantive as to why you think. As to why you think. Look, it's not something that I'm willing to entertain. That this is somehow not a
Time,
Republican.
please. One at a time, please.
Held state Senate and Congress, which was vetoed by a Republican, I believe, in Nevada, Republican.
Correct. Yeah.
As I've said, in today's climate, what we see is Democrats have adopted they adopted infringing gun rights as a major policy they want to push forth. And quite frankly, I think it's just simply for optics for people in other states. Because if you look at Nevada, it's actually a very red state. And, because of population density in Las Vegas and stuff like that, you have a very large Democrat state Senate and Congress. But as I've said, this battleground that you see between Democrats and Republicans is perhaps a more recent, phenomenon where Republicans are simply responding to Democrat-pushed bills simply on account that Republicans like to react negatively to anything Republicans put forth. However, as I've stated, because the legal challenges to all of these bills are nonpartisan, and because a large portion of the population, which I have demonstrated is actually non-politically aligned, supports, I would argue, gun ownership because they own guns, that your entire paradigm that you're creating is incorrect. But let's move on.
Yeah, 80% of people in the US support gun control, and only one of the examples I just gave in a quick Google search actually falls within what you just said. Only one of the examples that I gave was actually a Republican responding to what you see as optics. Do you think that given that the largest killer of children aged 1 to 14 is a gun in the US, do you think that it might be a little bit more than optics that sees Democrat? Do you think the Democrats are responding to a little bit? And again, I'm no fan of Democrats. I'm quite utilitarian when it comes to who I'm going to support politically. And from that standpoint, it would appear that the Democrats do actually want to do something about gun reform. Can you sort of talk to that a little bit? Do you think that maybe it's a little bit more than just optics, as you put it? I'd say that that's a little bit callous to suggest that the only reason that the Democrats are pushing for a level of gun reform, and remember that most of the examples that I just gave on legislation are not instances of Republicans rolling back Democrat pushed or Republican pushed or whatever historical revisionism you wanted to do there about gun law. These are new things that the Republicans are introducing that are reducing the ability of states to keep their kids alive, basically, and to protect their people. So do you think it's purely optics? And can you expand on why you think it's just optics that people would want to protect their children?
If you have 500 million, that's 500 million guns in the country, how is making it harder to buy a new gun from the gun store going to prevent kids from being shot? Please explain that.
We have a lot of cars in Australia, yet we recognize that cars are the biggest killer of people aged 1 to 14. One of the big differences there is cars actually have a utility in Australia. What you're basically saying is it's too hard because there are so many of these things in society that don't really have a purpose in civilian hands. That's not really an argument in my eyes.
That may be your whatever. Okay, what I'm saying is that if you have 500 million guns, how is preventing new gun sales going to prevent civilians from getting access to guns?
Well, you don't just in the raft of gun control measures in Australia, you also have the amnesty on what you do is you look, what utility does this thing have in society? And if the answer is none, then you remove it from society. It's quite simple. And 80% of Americans support some level of change.
Americans in your polling, which is good, but we can skip past that.
Is
the
do
CDC,
you have
before
any
they
other
actually
polling
stopped
that would?
publishing data regarding defensive gun use, because it's now a politically affiliated organization. The CDC, up until 2018, I believe, estimated between 1.5 to 3 million defensive gun uses in the United States every year. So that is a very strong utility compared to, I believe, under 30,000. If you remove suicides, under 30,000 mass shooting deaths in the United States. So 1.5 to 3 million defensive uses compared to 30,000 deaths excluding suicide, I think shows a very very good purpose for firearms. However, the purpose of firearm ownership in the United States is in order to give the civilian the power to defend themselves from federal tyranny. That's the basis for the Second Amendment. It's the reason why the Second Amendment was actually included in the Bill of Rights before 9 of 13 states actually ratified it, which made the Constitution legally binding in the colonies. So if we actually look at the formation of the United States and the basis for the Second Amendment, we see the utility of firearm ownership is actually ingrained into the Constitution and into the history, logos, and ethos of the United States. Because firearm ownership is seen as the way for the civilian to organize around and defend themselves from federal tyranny. And we see 3 million, so 1.5 to 3 million instances of self-defense use of firearms in the United States. I would argue that firearms actually provide a far greater utility than motor vehicles.
Okay. Yeah, a 2016 study by Harvard showed that a gun is no more useful than a baseball bat in defending yourself. And a lot of the statistics that you're bringing forward, most of what a lot of those statistics and the data shows in that regard is that guns are effective at protecting property. They're not effective at they don't make you any safer. Right, and the studies have shown. The studies have. Can I finish? That's not the. May I finish?
Use is that what you're arguing?
Well, I didn't hear what you said because you spoke over me while I was still finishing my point. So the studies actually showed that a gun is no more effective than a baseball bat or other self-defense item when it comes to.
You just wait. Hold on.
You've talked over me again.
If,
I apologize that my
Kaisersultan, can you please let P Barnz finish his point?
Then the reality is that in
Kaisersultan, can you please?
Is going to be much more useful in killing someone that is harming you or your property. That's just the reality, which your own statistics earlier argued. So if you are trying to say that guns are somehow less effective than a baseball bat in a life and death situation, I would say that I would have to look at your study and the people that did the study and the methods, and sort of give them a gun and let them shoot it, and give them a baseball bat and show them how one is clearly more effective. But the fact remains that between 1.5 to 3 million defensive uses of firearms of both life and property, which I do not see as existing property, making it any less valuable. Because there's 1.5 to 3 million uses of that every year, then we, should. I think that's a very good case that they have the thing. They're saying stop over talking. I cannot hear when I talk in the mic, so let's set up a system for that really quickly.
Well, look, if I could just respond to what you were saying there. So there's a lot of conflicting stats. I know that people like to trot out that 1 million. The more common, the more common statistic was the 1990 study that showed that 2.5 million people use them each year to defend themselves or property. That analysis from the 1990s was quite faulty. The National Crime Victimization Survey actually pegs the number of people who use guns in that manner to roughly 100,000 per year. And as I said, it's not me that's saying these things. You keep saying you're saying that a baseball bat's no more effective. And look, yeah, we could set up a person with a baseball bat and a baseball bat and a gun and see which is more effective in inflicting harm on someone. Luckily, actual science and actual studies are done in a little bit more of a rigorous a little bit more of a rigorous manner than that. And a lot of the studies show that guns help in protecting property, not in protecting you. And they're no more effective than a baseball bat or something else. So can we move on? Do you think
That's
that
kind of ridiculous? So you tell me if I run at you at a knife, okay, and you either have a gun or a baseball bat in your hand, the result is going to be the same. Is that what you're telling me?
in terms of protecting yourself and property, I'm not saying that. The data shows that.
That's not showing that. A Harvard study, which we have not examined, is showing that. And I'm telling you, just based on this simple, examination of the reality, I would, pretty much. Okay, rather than focusing on the Harvard,
rather than focusing on the facts and the data,
show somehow if your life is under attack, that having a baseball bat is. I mean, if that's the case, then why don't the military use baseball bats? The fact is that the statistics remain, and these are CDC statistics, that defensive use of firearms is very high, which is the reason they actually stopped reporting defensive firearm statistics. And the number of people who defend themselves with a firearm is much higher than the number of people who are unjustly killed by a firearm, which means overall it's a net positive use. But even if, and I present this argument, even if the number of unlawful deaths or immoral deaths by firearms outnumbered the number of defensive uses, the fact remains that the purpose of firearm ownership in the United States is to protect oneself from federal tyranny. And so by giving the civilian population firearms, you give them the ability to organize and fight against federal forces that come in to infringe upon their rights. So there's a reason why the First Amendment is immediately followed by the Second Amendment. And there's a reason why the states that ratified the Constitution only did so when the first 10 amendments were added. This serves a specific purpose, which, regardless of legal, illegal, moral, immoral, property, or personal use, the defense against federal tyranny is the basis of gun ownership in the United States. And so whatever statistics you bring and whatever data, even if what you're saying is true, it does not affect that, the basis for the Second Amendment. The other thing is that the Supreme Court found that the Second Amendment supports and justifies the ownership of firearms for personal defense. And in their opinion, they actually characterized a semi-automatic handgun as the quintessential self-defense firearm. And so what we can see here is that legally, according to the Supreme Court and the Constitution of the United States, firearm ownership is a protected right which the government cannot infringe upon. So quite frankly, I think it's irrelevant what statistics you bring and what statistics I bring, because based on methodology and based on sample size and how you characterize violent incidents, you can skew the data one way or another. The point remains that firearm ownership is a legally protected right in the United States, and anything that infringes upon that is unconstitutional and therefore illegal. So,
sure. So one of the first things
I'll let you go first and outline specific policies you want to enact, and I'll respond to them, I guess.
Sure. Well, what I'll do first is I'll respond to what you've just said about the US Constitution. One of the first things that was drafted into the Australian Constitution when we were federalised in 1900 was that the Indigenous populations were not to be counted in the census. It was to be a white country, and only white people were to be counted in the census. Do you think that happens now? And do you think that because that was written into our Constitution originally, do you think that that's something that should have remained?
I mean,
or is it important that
I would respond to it by saying that I'm not arguing for specific laws in the Constitution. What I'm saying is that specific rights, which are not actually given by the Constitution, but the Constitution says are innate, self-evident human rights. The Constitution simply codifies them. Rights, not specific laws, according to the Constitution, are the basis for the democracy that the United States has. And so, quite frankly, infringing on individual rights, whether it be the First, Second, Third, Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, Seventh, Eighth, Ninth, or 10th Amendment, is to be taken a lot more seriously than changing, for example, a legal designation laid out in the Constitution with regards to government organization. Because, as I think I stated before, the Bill of Rights is the basis for the states ratifying the Constitution. In other words, if you change the Bill of Rights, then you have changed the basis upon which the states have agreed to ratify to the Constitution. In your specific example, you're pointing out a, how would you say, a designation
the right for
the United States had. And
well, if I can clarify for you,
slavery, because it was unjust. However, slavery and
wasn't slavery.
The,
can I clarify my point for you?
Being in the persecution of another race is not the same as the rights a human being has innately. In other words, in your example, we're in Australia. They, persecuted and were horrible and, genocided Native people. It's not the same thing as, the rights a human being innately has, which are codified by the Constitution. So it's comparing apples to oranges.
I think you're slightly missing my point. The Constitution gave the government the right to not count certain people within the Constitution. And what we did is we recognized that that was archaic and that was no longer relevant to Australian society. So unfortunately, it did take until the 70s. It did take until the 70s until we actually changed the Constitution. Until we actually changed the Constitution. I'm not finished.
Point is that
I'm not finished.
You just said it yourself. It gives you the right. Okay, all right, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So what I'm saying is that regardless of our Constitution in Australia is just as difficult to amend as the US Constitution, right? We've only amended it 8 times compared to your 21, 28 or something like that amendments that you've had to the US Constitution, right? So what I'm saying is that a constitution is supposed to be a living document and it is supposed to reflect the times. I would argue that you're saying that, and regardless of, and I mean, we could probably talk for another hour on the fact that the Supreme Court of the United States is a court in fucking name only these days. I mean, let's face it, it's bought and paid for. It's bought and paid for by the Republican Party.
I mean, the entire structure.
I'm not finished. Not finished.
What's your basis
for
not finished? Even going down the legal route anyway.
Cool. So, as I was saying, the Constitution and constitutions are designed to be living documents that update themselves. So I reject your argument that this is something to do with protecting yourselves from government tyranny. I think that the government has a responsibility to protect its people from gun ownership in the US. But with the limited time that we have left, can you tell me why? Like you've told me that yes, the Supreme Court has decided that gun ownership should remain in the US. Do you think that the statistic around children, around the most, right now, if a child walks out of their door in the US, the most dangerous thing that they can come across is a gun? Do you think that's a good statistic for a first world nation?
Is banning new firearm purchasing going to prevent access to guns and reduce the shooting of children is my question to you.
Well, I'd say that that's not really a response to. Do you think that? Okay, let me put it this way. Do you think that something should be done about that statistic? And if so, what would you do?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to do that, I think first and foremost, a big step in the correct direction would be reducing wealth inequality. And if you look at a lot of these shootings, they're actually innocent bystanders getting shot in drive-bys and gang shootings and in violent crimes, home break-ins, things like that. So if you actually reduce the crime rate in the United States, you would automatically reduce the gun death rate in the United States, and because of that, the children's gun death rate in the United States. So I believe if you reduce wealth inequality, improve social welfare programs, improve healthcare access, then you would see a reduction in gun deaths because you would see an overall reduction in crime.
You'd see a reduction in crime, yes, but do you think there's more of an appetite to wouldn't it be easier to remove the guns than it would be to? I mean, I'm pretty sure that there's. I'm not finished. I am not finished.
Ownership. That's my question.
I was in the middle of saying something. I'm going to appeal to the moderators here because it seems to be happening quite often that I'm in the middle of a sentence and Kaiser wants to talk over me. But what I was saying is that do you think that there is more appetite in the US to deal with income equality? Do you think there's more of an appetite to deal with income inequality than there is gun control? Because, I mean, as we discussed earlier, we know who is preventing gun control in the US, and they are those that are pushing for more income inequality, for less healthcare, and for less mental health. Every solution that you bring up, those that are actually on your side when it comes to gun control are against the proposals that you're putting forward. So I fail to see how any of these are an actual solution.
All right, I'll have to go back again, as I've stated and presented actually. Most of the challenges to gun control at a state level have been by grassroots organizations that are not involved and don't put forth public opinions regarding healthcare or crime and stuff like this. They're simply grassroots gun rights organizations. So you keep saying that the people protecting gun rights in the United States are opposed to healthcare and social welfare and stuff like this. What I'm saying is that actually, if you look at the lawsuits and the removal of gun laws, these are being done by nonpartisan organizations. So I'll say it again. Republicans are not the ones that are removing gun laws. Organizations like FPC, GOA, NYPRA, CPRA, these are the organizations removing gun laws, and these are nonpartisan organizations. So the entire paradigm which you are presenting, where it's Republicans are the vanguard against Democrats taking your guns away, this is a false paradigm, because the people protecting gun rights in the states and at a federal level with the recent Supreme Court decision are nonpartisan organizations.
Okay. And look, I'll appeal to anyone in the audience to just Google Republican gun law, and they'll see a litany of articles written just in the last week that directly contradicts what you're saying. I just to suggest that it's grassroots organizations that are having more of an impact than Republican legislators is just nonsense.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Okay. So you said that. Okay. In the last 5 years, okay, can you put forth a single lawsuit against a gun control law that was, started and finished by the NRA? Can you do that?
That's not my. Why would I do that? That's not my argument. It's your argument talking about lawsuits. What I'm saying is that the NRA spends between. You asked me a question. You asked me a question. Please allow me to respond. Right. What I'm saying is that the NRA, when a child dies in a school, the NRA's membership surges, and the NRA, the amount of money that the NRA has available to them increases. They use that money and they give that money to Republican legislators to enact law. Right. As I'm looking at now, a list of news articles from the past week showing many Republican lawmakers in many states, and some being introduced federally, now that the Republicans control the House, of Republicans loosening gun control in the US. They are actively making this worse, and they are funded by the NRA. The NRA doesn't need to, for my argument to actually show that the NRA is funding and the Republicans are preventing gun control in the US, my argument does not rely on there being lawsuits, right? My argument relies on Republicans in power in states that are gerrymandered to the hilt so that they retain power, in states where they're actively trying to change election, either denying election results or actively trying to change election rules so that they retain power. A very small number of well-funded, powerful people are preventing gun control in the US, and they're funded by the NRA. I don't care what grassroots organizations are doing, because they don't like Democrat-run states. Most of the states that you mentioned and gave specifics on for those lawsuits were Democrat-run states. Of course, there's going to be grassroots organizations. There's going to be fringe groups and people running around pretending to be paramilitary organizations in Democrat-run states that don't like gun laws. Of course, that's going to be the case. It's got nothing to do with my argument.
All right, we will have to go back to this point again. At a state level, which is where the majority of gun laws are enacted. All right. So, for example, the assault weapons bans are present in, I believe, 12 states currently right now. And so gun control is actually a state-by-state issue. It's not a federal issue, it's a state-by-state issue. Gun laws are enacted at the state level. And at the state level, the challenge to gun laws is done by grassroots organizations, and therefore, practically on the ground, if you look state by state, in every state, for example, there's a very big lawsuit in Texas recently regarding the age to purchase a handgun. I gave that as an example. I find Texas to be, I don't find Texas to be a democratic state, but if you want to put that argument, it's a bit strange. Because it's a state-by-state issue, the grassroots organizations are fighting against gun infringement state by state. You are attempting to show that because in the at a federal level, the partisan gun dynamic exists, that this is where gun laws are practically enacted. What I'm saying is that they're enacted at the state level and they're being fought at the state level by nonpartisan groups. But we're going back and forth on this. I'm getting kind of frustrated in this, and you're shaking your head because you're kind of frustrated.
Well, it's not frustration.
What specific policy do you want to enact regarding firearms?
It's not necessarily frustration that it's going backwards and forwards. It's that you're adding stuff into my argument that I didn't put in there. Only one of the examples I gave was actually a law at the federal level. All of the rest, I agree, it is Republicans at a state level that is making it easier for people to own firearms. What specific legislation? I'd just follow I would pick one of any other comparable, 100% comparable Western nation, and I'd just model their gun laws because they've been shown to work.
Okay, what specific policy do you want to enact that you believe would reduce the number of firearms in civilian hands?
Well, I can talk to what Australia did do and what has reduced gun ownership in civilian hands and has prevented gun deaths in Australia. Every gun sale needs to be nationally registered. Anyone who owns a gun needs a genuine reason. I think that the US needs to let go. I mean, the data doesn't back up guns having any sort of purpose as a personal self-defense weapon. It's mainly to protect property. So remove self-defense as a legitimate reason for owning a firearm. In reality, there's no requirement for a semi-automatic weapon in society. And if you own a gun, you need to be able to store it safely. For many people around the world, right? And remember, Florida, Ron DeSantis in a closed door meeting recently signed concealed carry laws. The mere concept of being able to walk around the streets with a firearm is just something that's foreign to most Western countries. But like I said, most Western countries did something about this 30 years ago.
Okay, solution is to remove the ability to legally own firearms for self-defense and protection of property. Okay, I find that tyrannical and horrible, but wherever you have your Harvard study that shows the baseball bat is more effective. So I'm sure that we can replace our military's handguns and rifles with baseball bats. Practically, how would you go about removing guns from civilian hands?
Firstly, nothing that I mentioned talked about the military. Obviously, I mean, I've used the term military-style weapons a number of times. I'm not suggesting that we look how we divert funding away from the military and into more meaningful areas in society is probably a different conversation. But I'm not suggesting that we remove guns from the military. Again, that's something that you're injecting into my argument that just wasn't there in the first place. What was the other point that you made that I wanted to jump on there? Yeah, and again, your misunderstanding of the study talking about the uses of guns as personal self-defense is. I mean, as notwithstanding, you can do your test of a baseball bat versus a firearm if you like. It's not how actual real science is done. How would you remove them? Well, what we did in Australia, obviously, you'd need to do it for more than 2 years. We had a 2-year amnesty. We funded a gun buyback scheme. There was an increase. I believe there was a 1% increase in the Medicare levy. The Medicare levy is at 1%. For every dollar earned over 28,000, I think you pay 1% or 1 cent in the dollar above 21,000. That pays for our social health care system. It was increased by 1 cent. There was an amnesty of 2 years. And what we found is that, and like I said before, Australia at the time, we had a politically powerful rural community. We had grassroots organizations that were against gun control. We had shrill cries from our gun lobby that there'll be a civil war. We had people complaining about tyranny and all these other sort of, and all the same nonsense. Within 2 years, we'd solve the problem. So I would suggest
what are you going to do when you enact your amnesty and no one hands in their guns?
The same question was asked here. They did hand in the guns.
Okay, so when the U.S. population doesn't hand in their guns?
Well, then by the time they become illegal, you now have an illegal firearm.
So you're going to see police with guns to take away people's guns, correct?
I mean, eventually, if it comes to it, but what we've seen in every other country, it doesn't come to that. These are scare campaigns.
Yeah, a million guns in the United States, and I'm interrupting you here because you talk way too long after each other. Specifically on this issue, right? You have 500 million guns.
Yes.
In civilian hands. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You are operating on the assumption that one, when you make them illegal, everyone would hand them in, and secondly, if they don't hand them in, the police is going to be able to go door to door without getting shot and confiscate these firearms. Do you see how this is a drastically different environment to Australia or Western Europe or Argentina or another gun owning country?
I see it as different in that we decided to do something 30 years ago.
Okay,
like I said,
so no
no
challenge faced by the government in trying to confiscate the 500 billion firearms from 300 million people.
Those threats were made in Australia, and they turned out to be nothing.
Okay, but they have 500 million guns, did they? And they did not have as widely spread amongst the population firearm rate as Australia did.
So because they're in different places and because it's a big number, we shouldn't do anything? Is that what you're saying?
No, so many people in America have a gun, more people, I would say. How about this? Okay, if almost everyone has a gun, okay, how are you going to go around and take everyone's gun without getting into essentially a civil war? Is my question.
I'm not supporting taking everyone's guns. I'm supporting removing guns that don't have a legitimate use in society. That don't
Okay,
have any.
but
That don't. I'm
what
supporting. I'm
firearms do you think
supporting.
do not have a
I am
legitimate use in
still
society?
talking. I'm supporting removing guns that don't have a utility in society, and I'm supporting. And I'm promoting those who actually have a legitimate need having guns, and the rights of those who need firearms and those who have a utility in a firearm for keeping those firearms. And the way that you do that is by ensuring people that don't need
Okay, that's fine.
guns,
Look,
and by
what
ensuring that, and by
firearms do you think
ensuring,
have no utility in society? Which specific firearm?
well, in Australia, we removed semi-automatic rifles, handguns, and semi-automatic shotguns.
Okay, so almost the entirety of all guns owned in the United States.
You can
Almost
own
every
you
gun
can
in the
you can
United
own
States,
bolt
I think
action
over
you can
80%
own bolt
of
action
guns in the United
rifles
States
and
are
lever
either
action rifles.
semi-automatic or pump action. So you are attempting to remove 80% of firearms from the civilian population.
Yep, like we did in Australia.
Yes, so you're
To protect
10%
children,
of
yes.
that's 400 billion guns. I mean, assuming that there's only been 100 million guns in circulation before 1986. So let's say 400 billion. You're attempting to remove 400 billion guns from the population. This is your argument, is that correct?
My argument is to, and I think that we're pushing towards closing statements soon. My argument is that those who require a firearm in society should have protections in place so that they can keep those firearms. What I'm suggesting is that if there is something in society that's killing children, and if the most dangerous thing if the most dangerous thing to a child when they walk out the door is something that doesn't have a utility in society, you remove that thing from society. That's what I'm suggesting.
Okay. Practically, I'm telling you what you're suggesting means taking 400 million guns away. Do you understand that? Do you acknowledge that?
Yes, I understand that. Big problem. Hard problem. That's why you start doing something about it now. That's why we did something. That's why we did something 30 years ago. That's why we did something 30 years ago.
A situation where the police and the National Guard is outgunned by the civilian population. So it's practically improbable the police and the National Guard will come under fire. There will be civil war if you do this. And so
yep,
it's not
that was threatened here as well. Yeah, I was a teenager when they threatened that here. I mean, I think they're just
between the United States and Australia is that in the United States, the civilians do not have as many guns. They do not have the access to. I mean, first of all, this is 80%. These are semi-automatic. This including legally owned machine guns, legally owned destructive devices. You're really setting up a situation where there's a guerrilla war campaign between the federal government and the civilian population. That's what you're setting up. And the reason I'm saying this is because unlike in Australia, in the United States, firearm ownership is a legally protected right, and a large portion of the population views it as a God-given right, or if you're an atheist, an innate self-evident right. And so a challenge to their firearm ownership is as good as a challenge to their being, or their First Amendment rights, or their Third Amendment rights. So you're going to have a much more violent reaction, and the civilian population in the United States is much more able to give a violent reaction. So it's very more likely that you'll have a violent reaction in the United States than in a country like Australia.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. We will be doing our closing statements now. Each of you will make a short closing statement, and then we will move on to our audience questions. Since P Barnz was kind enough to go first, we will let Kaisersultan do the first closing statements. Kaisersultan, would you like to make your closing statement? Thank you.
Here's my closing statement. The paradigm here is very simple. firearm ownership is a innate, self-evident right enshrined by the Constitution. In order to remove that, P. Barnz is suggesting that we change the Constitution. He is arguing that self-defensive use and protection of property are not, useful uses of firearms, and his solution is to send in the military and police to confiscate 400 million guns from the civilian population, because he believes that he's going to have a amnesty period, and anyone that does not hand in the amnesty period will face jail time and have to face police action. So his solution is to spark a potential civil war, change the Constitution of the United States, and also, infringe on people's innate self-evident rights. And I think that is laughable and impractical. And even if you did change the legal framework, practically the federal government does not have the ability, and it is impossible, I would say, not improbable, impossible, for it to win a war that it wages against its own civilian population. He's going to argue that they did it in Australia, and that they did it in Germany, and that they did it in the United Kingdom, and that therefore confiscation, buybacks would work in the United States. I'm saying that the United States is different from Australia, United Kingdom, Germany, and Spain as well. I think had a major buyback, because the United States has 500 million guns in civilian circulation, 80% of which are, I believe it's 80%, I could be wrong, it's between 60 and 80%, but let's go with 80%, because you also have to factor in 3D printed guns, ghost guns, guns that have serial number, home builds, rebuilds, stuff like that, conversions. You have to do all those. So let's say 80%. The civilian population has 400 million semi-automatic rifles, handguns, shotguns that it would be able to effectively use against any force. And so his essential argument is good faith. He's putting forth an argument of good faith and a hypothesis that if you make guns illegal, everyone will hand them in, and there will be no violent reprisal. That's his argument. I think that is a line that you do not want to cross, and it is an infringement on a human being's innate ability to defend themselves and their property, and it is also illegal. So if you have to change innate human rights, the entire legal system, and send in the police, I think that your solution is impractical and it should not be implemented.
Thank you, Kaisersultan, for your closing statement. P Barnz, would you like to make your closing statement?
Absolutely. The main purpose of the US Constitution is to protect US citizens' life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What Kaiser is putting forward is the continuation of a small minority of people protecting what they call an innate right based on an archaic scenario where the government at any point, or England are just going to sail over the horizon and try to take back the colonies. It's based on something that happened over 200 years ago and bears no relevance in modern society. I would argue that a child's rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is far more important than an individual's right to own multiple firearms. Kaiser's argument seems to be, when you actually bring it down to what we should do about it, the solutions that he is proposing are opposed by those who are maintaining the status quo. None of what he said about legal action bears any relevance to the reality of Republicans enacting laws that make it easier to put guns in the hands of children and put guns in schools and put guns in the hands of more people, right? Basically, to boil his argument down, 500 million is a big number, so a child's right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness should be infringed by a small minority of people. And I'd like to thank the moderators, and thank you, Kaiser, for the debate.
so much for your closing statement, P Barnz. It is now time to take our audience questions. We will read as many as we have time for. So let's begin. I think we have one question for our debaters. This is from Let's Farm. Are there any individuals or groups that you feel should never own a firearm?
For me, no. I don't think that there are necessarily in Australia. If you're convicted of a violent crime, there are a lot of circumstances in Australia where you won't be permitted to own a firearm, or you do need to give up your firearms in certain circumstances. So look, there are probably I'm more focused on purpose. I think there are purposes for firearms that should be restricted. One of those being self-defense, because the data shows that self-defense isn't that you don't need. I mean, Australians have been quite capable of defending themselves for the past 30 years without firearms. So for me, it's more utility rather than individuals.
Australia have 500 million guns. This is the point which he is not answering, which is that the guns are already out there. Everyone has guns. So you're defending yourself against someone with guns. That's already happened. The guns are out there. So he has to have his forced confiscation, which I say, and I think a lot of people believe is going to lead to civil war. Should certain people not have firearms? Well, this is an interesting question. I believe it's more of a moral question. It leads more into what values you place importance on. For example, should a violent felon still have the ability to defend themselves, even though they've shown that they will use the firearm against someone else unjustly? It's an interesting question. I would say that if you increase mental health barriers and introduce things like mandatory insurance, mandatory registration, increased taxes, what you will see is a inability for trans people, people with depression, people with mental health issues. You're going to see a purposeful targeting of LGBT people, which I'm sure you don't want to see. So you're going to prevent LGBT people from being able to get guns. You are going to prevent the poor people from getting guns, and because there's a large overlap between minorities forming a larger portion of how would you say it politically correctly, poor people, essentially, you're going to be disproportionately affecting Black, Hispanic, and LGBT people from being able to own firearms through proposals such as mandatory insurance, increased tax, and mental health reporting. That's what I would say to that.
Yeah. Can I just put a quick point in there that it's really only conservatives that believe that LGBT or trans people are actually mentally ill. That's something that you're injecting into there, and it's a pretty disgraceful disgraceful dig that you're making.
For example, trans people are overrepresented in negative temperament, and their
this is all bullshit. Yeah.
Strongly correlated with other.
This is all absolute nonsense, and that's not what I'm here to debate.
And stuff like that, which would lead to prevention from firearm access. So what I'm saying is, indirectly, I'm not saying that if you prevent, people with certain mental conditions from owning firearms, that all trans people. What I'm saying is that a disproportionate number of trans people. So you could argue it's targeted. The same thing with, income. If you increase taxes and force people to have gun insurance, then you're going to price out poor communities, and as a result of that, you're going to price out a large number of Hispanic and Latino people. So it's kind of interesting. The left gun control are the ones claiming to be for equality and everything, but the policies that they're trying to enact will
we have another audience question for our debaters.
Rich, as they claim, white, straight Republicans, and keep guns out of the hands of minorities, and LGBT people.
If I could just quickly respond to the
Yes.
nonsense that he just
Yes,
put
of
forward.
course.
So
Yes.
so on the mental health issue that Kaiser just brought up around trans people. Yes, is it true that trans people intersect with mental health more than other people do? But when we actually look at the data and when we actually look at the reasons behind it, it's because of people like Kaiser. That's why they face higher instances of mental health. It's because of the way that people like Kaiser, in just bringing them up as an example in this discussion now, which was 100% not necessary, and I know exactly why he did it, but it is because of attitudes like his, and it's because of social pressures that people like him put on the community that mean they intersect with mental health. So yes, it could be that if there are increased mental health checks for gun ownership, that trans people would be overrepresented in those who aren't allowed to own a firearm. But the reasons behind that mental health issue are because of societal pressures and comments like Kaiser just made.
I mean, I see how that's relevant.
Right, we have a question. Kaiser, please. Kaiser, please.
You know, the barriers that you increase prevent minorities and LGBT people from owning firearms. Thanks for admitting that.
No, that's not the case. And moving on to our next question from Julian dos Santos Matos. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Have any of you been robbed at gunpoint?
No, we removed guns from society here in Australia about 30 years ago. So it's something that I've never had to face. Luckily, children and adults in Australia, I had, it's a car accident that I'm far more at risk of dying from in Australia than it is a gun, because we don't own them. We don't need them.
P Barnz, that if you get held at gunpoint, your chances are just as good if you have a baseball bat as if you have a gun. That's what he believes.
It's a misrepresentation of what I said.
No, that's literally what he said. The Harvard study shows
said.
that a baseball bat is just as effective in self-defense as a firearm. Therefore, in this instance, where your self-defense, where you are required to, defend yourself, you by deduction, would be as well off having a baseball bat being held at gunpoint as if you had a firearm on you.
Yeah, I don't think I need. People can rewind and actually listen to what I've said about the study, and I'm happy to share the resources that I've used in the debate.
Okay, so in this instance, if you're held at gunpoint, you'd be better off having a gun than if you have a baseball bat, correct?
The study that I brought up showed that a firearm is yeah, and you didn't answer it, and you didn't answer a lot of the questions that I asked you directly. You didn't answer a lot of the questions that I asked you directly during the debate as well. And this is the open questions. So if you want to ask it, but I'll answer how I will.
Have another question.
Would you rather have a baseball bat or a gun?
We have another question, Kaisersultan, please. From I cannot pronounce your name. I'm so sorry. Ilef. Yeah, Ilef. For Kaisersultan, who would win? The US Armed Forces with individuals highly trained in various combat scenarios and armed with a baseball bat, or US citizens armed with automatics?
I mean, this is a good question. If the U.S. Army switched to baseball bats, which are, just as effective as a gun in self-defense, then I think that it would be a very good argument. I mean, the question really is, if the U.S. Army with its baseball bats attacked the civilian population with baseball bats, would the effects be the same as if both had guns? Since, they're both just as useful in a self-defense situation.
Thank you for answering that. I would like to thank you all tonight for coming. This one guy, Bruce, Hannah, Jihan, and the other audience members. Thank you so much
Can
for
I put it
joining
really
us
quick before
tonight.
we go? It'll be like 10 seconds.
Okay.
Okay, there's a bit of a misunderstanding here. I just want to clarify, right? People misunderstand. Assault weapon is a legal term that describes physical characteristics. So when you see people saying they want to ban assault weapons, what they really want to do is ban the way certain guns look. The same thing with semi-automatics. Semi-automatics are the vast majority of firearms. So whenever you see gun control people saying they want to ban assault weapons and semi-automatics means they want to ban the majority of guns, and assault weapons means they want to ban guns that look a certain way. That's my point. I just want to clarify. Thank you.
Okay. We hope you all enjoyed the show tonight. Our participants' links are in the description, and if you like their performance here, please consider subscribing to their channels. Remember to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel as well. Make sure you hit the bell so you don't miss any of our exciting contents coming up. And thank you again all for coming. Remember, let's not fight. Let's debate the topics and let's talk about the issues. Thank you so much for being here.